So how has the sharing economy or collaborative economy managed to become a mainstay of tourism activity? Tourism has traditionally been framed as an industry, and so governments have tended to respond with a whole range of neoliberal policy measures, for example, aimed at boosting investment, increasing competitiveness, marketing and promotion to increase consumer awareness, and of course to reduce barriers to growth. But there are growing concerns over the range of impacts of collaborative platform in tourism, and this has called for alternative socio-political models of tourism that can more effectively address sustainable development. And it's within this ideological space, effectively, that the collaborative economy has gained momentum in tourism. So we've seen tourism-related collaborative economy activities grow enormously in scale and scope over recent years. And this has been fueled by a whole range of social, economic and technological factors. And these include, for example, a shift away from ownership towards temporary access to goods, the use of technology-mediated transactions between producers and consumers, a more direct host-guest relationship in the context of accommodation platforms, and higher levels of consumer risk-taking, which is balanced against trust-engendering mechanisms such as peer-to-peer feedback systems. But the resulting impacts of this major disruptive shift are being particularly felt in local places, in local neighbourhoods, where they tend to create tensions in the social fabric of the place, and also cause questionable effects upon the day-to-day community and commercial life, including, for example, an increase in living costs and housing market speculation. So let's talk about these impacts that result from collaborative platforms in tourism. The first thing to note that in many cases, local places haven't taken any negative impacts of platforms lying down. And this rapid emergence of collaborative economy platforms in tourism has been met with a strong critical response from social movements across the globe, lying in opposition to the negative impacts generated and the inherent contradictions within the rhetoric and narratives of many of the major platforms. And these contradictions generally derive from the collaborative economy platforms self-framing as more sustainable, more equitable alternatives to traditional business models, having a more authentic experience of places, for example, and in the context of accommodation platforms, a greater level of engagement between hosts and guest users. Also, platforms allegedly provide a more flexible source of income for users with spare capacity. However, the reality is often markedly different from this domestic scenario, and the subsequent exploitation of the collaborative economy as a form of platform capitalism raises questions of inequality and uneven development in terms of differential local scale impacts. As we're starting to know more about the identity and particulars of those that have provider listings on the major platforms, we begin to see that individuals with spare capacity are actually in the minority. Let's take the paradigmatic case of Barcelona, for example. Now, the city has a long and important tradition of neighbourhood social movements, and recently many of these local social movements that are in opposition to high levels of tourism saturation in Barcelona are gaining considerable momentum and visibility. These collectives are mobilising increasing levels of support and energy for their activism, which tends to be highly articulate, very organised, digitally and socially networked, and increasingly multinational in scope. And collaborative economy platforms tend to be one of their primary concerns, particularly the more extractive unicorn models such as the accommodation platform Airbnb. With a team of interdisciplinary researchers from the UOC, we're carrying out different funded projects on collaborative economy and tourism, working directly with different social movements via action research with the protest and resistance collectives, as well as analysing the narratives and discourses related to tourism and collaborative economy platforms. We're also trying to understand the spatial distribution of tourism saturation and tourism impacts in terms of where the key attraction nodes are, where the geographical distribution of traditional tourism accommodation lies, as well as the concentrations of resident populations. And this research allows us to contrast the degree of severity of the problems in contested residential and tourism spaces. And we see this as key in enabling a more nuanced and local-specific and contextualized understanding of the needs and priorities of each district and neighborhood in Barcelona. The project helps us to see how tourism saturation can be more sustainably managed to generate long-lasting and tangible benefits for those places and spaces that find themselves having to coexist with tourism on a day-to-day basis. Barcelona is a very extreme case indeed, but there are many others around the globe, and activists' efforts are starting to take effect as their activities become more global in reach via their network forms of resistance. And despite the premise that the collaborative economy appears to be addressing some of the limitations of the existing industrial tourism system in creative and disruptive ways, the truth is that the impacts, opportunities and threats of the collaborative economy in tourism are not fully understood. For example, we know very little about its wider impacts on local, regional and national economies and whether or how this might lead to the restructuring of tourism systems. We know even less about how it will affect citizens and communities in different geographical settings. And at the end of the day, particularly as regards the large extractivist tourism platforms, we need to be clear about the extent to which they're genuinely all about sharing in the initial cooperativist sense and grounded in the principles of more sustainable business models, or if they're merely extensions of traditional capitalist business models in tourism masquerading as more socially and environmentally sustainable alternatives through their particular rhetoric and narratives.